Well, hello there everybody, this is Agrippa Maxentius, and I'm going to be trying something a little different on this channel that I hope you guys will enjoy. It's actually a bit of history. There are certain historical conflicts I find very interesting. A lot of them, particularly the Spanish Civil War, the Russian Revolution, are huge ones. But one that I find mentioned very rarely, actually, is the Finnish Civil War. Now, we're not talking about the Civil War, or I should say, we're not talking about the war between Russia and Finland, with the Molotovs, that sort of thing, in 1938. That's not the war we're talking about here. This is actually a war that occurred in 1918, late January of 1918, and we're going to go ahead and talk about how it started, why it started, and what happened, essentially. So the first thing to keep in mind is that the beginning of the Finnish Workers' Revolution, which was a communist revolution, started on about this particular revolution as it was started by the Finnish Workers' Party. And the Finnish Workers' Party was actually quite a moderate party before a certain member or group of members of people called the Red Guards arrived. And the Red Guards were essentially Finns that had been trained in Russia, not only trained militarily, but also politically, to be able to spread the revolution, spread communism, and to try and import the revolution from Russia to Finland. Now, on 27th of January 1918, these forces took control of the party, and essentially they had what you could call a coup d'etat, where they overthrew the Finnish government. It was more of a military coup d'etat, or I should say a military coup d'etat led specifically by Red Guard units. Let's go ahead, and right now it's hard to do this while I'm also playing the game at the same time, but I'm trying to be effective in both places, so let's go ahead and move through and keep on going. Now, the Finnish Civil War was a very interesting conflict for a number of different reasons. One of those reasons is that, unlike the actual revolution in Russia against the Tsar, the Finns had actually enjoyed a period of relative calm and economic prosperity for quite a while. Sure, Finnish Red Guard units and actual Finnish socialist party members did support improving, living conditions, wages, this sort of thing. But in general, their main concern was really just making Finland an independent nation under any means necessary. And a lot of these socialists were not supporters at all of the Red Uprising. In fact, they wanted to be able to vote in their parties and weren't interested in a war that would drag on for many years, possibly, and cause a lot of death and bloodshed. That being said, the Red Revolution in Finland was still pretty bloody, irregardless. Finnish defeat? No. Now, it's quite interesting what actually began to happen. At the time of this war, there were actually now these Russians were not directly associated, well, let me be very, very specific here. These Russians were essentially not directly associated with combat. Yes, they did assist the Red Guard units, the Finnish Red Guard units, in a few battles, and they also provided logistics support to these Red Guard units whenever they could. But in general, the Russians stayed out of this war despite having about 150,000 troops in the area at the time. Only a very small minority of those troops ever actually came to battle and ever actually started fighting. In fact, in places like Luapa and Kalhava, and I know I'm probably butchering these names, Finnish civilians essentially walked up to Russian troops and said, "Give us your guns," and essentially disarmed them, set them on their way back to their lines, and told them, "We don't want you here." So this actually was something that began to happen. The Finns began to associate, particularly those on the white side. The white side would be the anti-Bolshevik side, the anti-communist side, began to associate Russian control with a lack of independence for Finland. And this, of course, was something that they just weren't having. They weren't going to accept it. It wasn't acceptable. It couldn't be done. Let's go ahead and go here. Now, at this time, I told you guys about the Red Guard units before, going to Russia and actually being trained by political commissars on how to create a revolution, how to deal with resistance, this sort of thing. And this began to happen quite a lot during this time period. Right there, we got a beautiful Finnish victory. That's awesome. Very similar to battles at the time. Battles at the time here, it wasn't, tens of thousands of men dying. It really was a few hundred on each side, sometimes just 10 or 20. In fact, there are a bunch of different instances of that happening, of smaller engagements taking place in this war. So it was not something that was hard to see happen. Now, at some point, the Russians really had to make a decision on whether or not they were going to openly support the Red Guards in this war. And they did, in fact. In 1918, Lenin decreed the war against the, and this is funny, he actually did here, and being in control, he sort of tried to create this vision of these White Guards, these vicious marauders, going around the landscape, killing people. And so he called it a war against the White Guards. But again, he was not directly involved in the sense that Russian troops were not told specifically to be on the battlefield. They were really there as an advisory role, much like you could say the U.S. is in Ukraine or Russia is in Ukraine as a sort of advisory role. However, in January of 1917, Lenin actually sent his Red allies in Finland 15,000 rifles, 2 million rifle cartridges, and 30 state-of-the-art machine guns. Doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're thinking about a conflict like this, it's actually a huge, huge deal. That really gave a lot of credit to the Red Uprising and made it a possibility, for sure. It's said by many Finnish scholars and many Finnish historians that without Lenin's support, without Lenin's direct military support of the conflict and him sending arms, it's unlikely that this revolution or this coup d'etat artillery sent by Lenin was a bit pathetic, and that's because you have to understand the Bolsheviks needed the artillery themselves. He only actually happened to send 10 cannons, 10 artillery pieces to help his Finnish allies, and he also sent, I believe, two panzer units, which I'm assuming, I'm not really, in the research I've done, I'm not sure what kind of panzer units were sent, but it was some sort of tank unit, probably something sufficient to win a few battles at least. Now, like I said before, guys, one of the scary things about this war was the nature of Russia's involvement. The Russians didn't want to directly say they were involved. In fact, in August of 1917, the Russians actually admitted that they had 125,000 troops in the region, the Soviets, down to 3,000. Now, I might be crazy and I might be biased, but I would assume that if that were the case, then it should probably, if you think about it, it's probably should be something more like 120,000, 130,000. It's unlikely that many troops would have left the country, especially during a time when the Russians were trying to establish control in Finland, or I should say the communists were trying to establish control in Finland. It's very unlikely that those troops would actually have left the field. So what's actually more likely is that these troops, essentially, or I should say the commanders, lied about how many troops were in the field so as not to create a major political international issue because, of course, they were supporting the Red Uprising here. I'm going to try to take Turku. By the way, Turku is a very important city. We'll get to that later, though. There's a bunch of other cities here that we'll talk about. In fact, one of the most important of all of them is Tampere, and we're going to talk about this particular city as we get to the end of our discussion. One thing I want to do, I really want to get this guy the hell out of here, but if I can't, I want to try to build a supply depot. Oh well, we'll move him over here, 8 days, and eventually we should be getting some reinforcements. In fact, I think this is a nice little bit of reinforcement we got here, although I'd like a commander, to be honest with you. Alright, guys. Sorry about that. Now, where were we last? First of all, I'm going to get some international volunteers. And actually, this brings me to, I can discuss something else, brings me to the Jaegers. The Jaegers were Finnish troops that were trained in Germany. Of course, during World War I, the Finns did send some troops to assist the Germans, the Central Powers. And these troops were battle-hardened and well-trained. And what happened was when as the Russians began to send their own armies to deal with the Finns, or I should say the Red Guards, the Finnish Red Guards, began to receive supplies from these Russians to create their own armies. And the Jaegers did have battle experience, unlike a lot of the Reds. Now, some of the Reds did have battle experience, but overall, the Jaegers really brought a lot to the actual fight for the White Armies. They really did. And that's something that probably will never be forgotten. Let's go ahead and engage here. I don't want to go into Helsinki yet because I want to build up my forces a little bit more before I jump in there. Helsinki is, of course, the main place we want to take here. And I'm going to go ahead and grab a few more units. All right, beautiful. Now, I said before when I started this video that this conflict was not a pretty one. It was a vicious one. And you would think that with the democratic nature of Finland, that the killings, the extrajudicial killings, would be a lot less likely. And I guess if you look at an overall population count, if you look at an overall kill count, that's probably true. At the end of the war, about 10,000 civilians, innocent civilians, had been killed by one side or another in extrajudicial killings. One of the most tragic of these events that occurred, actually, was in a village called Siun, and I'm going to totally butcher these names. I am not Finnish. I know I have some Finnish subscribers. You guys could probably give me the correct way of pronouncing Red teacher. Actually, some people say he was a socialist, but he was not supportive of the Red uprising. And they engaged in a small arms engagement with some Red Guards. Now, obviously, this is not the smartest idea in the world. A group of students engaging Red Guard units that are trained, that are prepared for a fight. This can lead to some pretty nasty stuff, without a doubt. And that's exactly what happened. Now, the Red Guards told the students that if they came out and surrendered, they would be spared. And they promised them this. They gave them their word. And that seemed to work out pretty well until a few Russian commissars pulled up in their vehicles and ordered that the students be shot, killed in this case. What's amazing, and actually a lot of people call this the miracle of Suinula, which is essentially that out of, and I think it was 56, 58 students, I may be wrong on this, only 16 died. The rest of them just threw themselves in the snow right as the machine gun was opening up, and I wish we could have done that in this battle because we just got crushed. But they threw themselves in the snow, and they played dead. And incredibly, by doing this, 40 of them survived. So remember, guys, if you're being lined up to get shot, play dead. It might be a good idea. They basically just threw themselves in the snow and feigned death. And that's a great thing. General von Mannerheim. But General von Mannerheim, for those of you that do not know, is not a Finnish general. He's Russian. German. I was going to say, I do believe he might have some Finnish roots. My studies on Mannerheim are not as extensive as my studies on the Finnish Civil War as a whole, so I'm not entirely sure if he has some Finnish in him. But what I do know is that he is, for the most part, a German general. But this was a good thing. He had battle experience. He knew what he was doing. And this was definitely going to come on, or it was going to become helpful towards the end of the war. So let's go ahead and keep on going here. Now, I told you guys that we would talk about the city of Tampere, and we are going to talk about that. Tampere, of course, was really the center, the bloodiest place to be in the entire war. And really, Tampere, you could say that this city was being defended. And if we take a look over here, this is Tampere. We've actually already taken it. Yes, I know, I'm great. But this city was essentially a Russian stronghold. And you could see why, or not a Russian stronghold. I keep saying Russian, and the reason I'm doing that is because I keep connecting the Bolsheviks from Russia with the Bolsheviks in Finland. But of course, these are two different countries, so we have to not make that mistake. But this is, of course, a strong point. You can see that there's lakes on either side. This is a really nice area to hold out. And this was being defended by 15,000 Red Guard units, and some people would say about 5,000 to 6,000 Russian support units that were providing mortar fire, artillery fire, this sort of thing. In fact, it's interesting to say that the White Armies received some Swedish assistance. It's quite interesting because I know from my Finnish friends there's a lot of anger or annoyance between the Finns and the Swedes, but actually there were Swedish units fighting on behalf of the Whites during the Battle of Tampere, and they were actually part of the reason why they were ultimately able to win. On about the 3rd of April of 1918, a German colonel known as Colonel Auswelt began a massive artillery bombardment on this city. And unfortunately, this leveled parts of the city, leaving a lot of people homeless. We're going to take Helsinki, I hope so. Yes, we've taken the capital. Glory. But it led a lot of people homeless, of course, and what happened was the Finnish soldiers began to push into the city. They were fighting for every inch of territory. This was truly a fight to the death. It was, the Red Guard units did not want to surrender. They wanted to fight to the end. Those Red Guard units that did come out and surrender were often shot by their own comrades. They were often just basically told, you can't give up here. But finally, on the 6th, it was an unconditional surrender by the Reds. The Reds finally came out of the government building and essentially admitted defeat. At this point, you could say that the Russians lost interest in the war. It was this victory that really showed the Russians that there was no benefit to them supporting the Finnish Reds if they could be beaten like this. It just wasn't going to happen. Now, you might think that's the end of everything, and indeed that is the end. That's when a lot of people talk about the end of the Finnish Civil War, the victory of the Whites against the Reds, and they see this as a sort of climax. General von Mannerheim actually drove an entire his entire army through the streets of Helsinki and claimed victory, and it was a glorious day for all Finns. Well, minus the red Finns, of course. We don't know the number of actual soldiers that died, but we can be certain that the white Finns, as well as the reds, did not treat their prisoners very well at all. And towards the end of the war, it was not unlikely at all for entire prisoners, entire regiments, to be taken out to the trenches and shot. And in fact, this happened quite a few occasions. You can actually look this up if you guys would like to. There's a place called the Pyniki Trenches. I think it's Pynikki. And this is an area where the whites would take a lot of Red Guards that they had captured in previous battles and essentially kill them. They would tell International Red Cross that they were going to drive them to a hospital. In reality, they were driving them to the trenches. But both sides did this, and like I said initially, the total number of civilians that died in this conflict is estimated to be about 10,000 innocents. That's also very likely, or very common for wounded red units, wounded red soldiers, to be taken in by hospitals, by Finnish hospitals, only for white units to come later and take them to their last little vacation. So this was a vicious war. In the end, the whites did win. They succeeded in driving the reds out, and they took over the government once again. And this led many years later, of course, to the conflict that the reds had with the Finns shortly before World War II. And this is usually the Finnish War most people know about, most people are interested in, not so much the Finnish Civil War, which is a much smaller conflict, but in reality, probably to the people of Finland, a much more important conflict. Not sure if that's actually true. My Finnish subs will have to tell me. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Like I said, this is really the first historical video I've ever done on the channel where I'm trying to discuss an actual historical event, and I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if it's something you want to see in the future, let me know. But keep in mind, I am not just taking a great interest in, probably because of my interest in the Bolshevik. Of course, that did not work in favor for the Bolsheviks. Anyway, I hope this was informative. I hope you guys enjoyed, and thank you so much for watching.